Welcome to the Five Smooth Stones podcast with Daniel Watts, the director of the EGM Institute.
Thanks for joining us for the Five Smooth Stones podcast. We have special guests today, Dr. Robert and Lori Crosby, and happy to have you here with us. Robert, tell us a little about yourself and what you're doing these days.
Well, sure. So I am a research psychologist. I have a long history in children's ministry. I've served in some capacity for about 25 years. And so I've kind of merged those two passions. And so now I study the science of children's ministry.
Well, you look pretty young for serving 25 years in children's ministry. You're aging well.
I started at 15.
There you
so
go.
You can work the math out there.
Okay, isn't it great how many children's workers that you talk to? I've talked to all over the world that actually started doing ministry when they were, some of them were still like 12 years old and they're helping out in the children's ministry. Lori, what are you up to these days?
So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and a registered play therapist supervisor. So I specialize in treating children who've experienced trauma.
Through play therapy?
Correct, yeah.
And how long have you had your practice?
Oh man, over 10 years now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the family?
Yes, we have two kids, Reagan, who is 10, and RJ, who is 6.
Great. So I know that you have just published a book, and the title is?
Trauma-Informed Children's Ministry, a practical guide to reaching hurting kids.
So tell us about the book.
Sure. So it is the culmination of about 10 years of children's ministry research, and it gives us a step-by-step instruction of how to do ministry in a way that kids who have a tough background, kids from tough places who have a hard time usually connecting, will be able to be loved and included and feel like they're part of the church and be able to heal and grow and succeed.
What caused you to get involved in researching and working in the area of trauma with children?
Well, it was sort of the merger of our two backgrounds.
Yes.
So I've been, doing research in children's ministry and in education, and so Lori is a child trauma therapist, and so we kind of marry those things together. What does it look like to do ministry with kids who experience trauma?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure people would love to hear about when you talk about trauma. What are we talking about? To define it, fill in the gap for us there. What does that mean, trauma, when you talk about kids today?
So trauma is like a situation or a really awful event that happens in the life of a person or a child that causes significant psychological harm, emotional, social,
And spiritual.
And spiritual, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so tell me, when you've been doing research with children experiencing trauma, what kind of things have you discovered in that research? Because you've been at it for 10 years and you're working directly with kids like that all the time. Before we go on, how many kids do you see in a typical week in your practice?
Usually about 15. I see kids and adults, but I specialize in kids, but I have maybe half and half.
And when you see children who've experienced trauma, do you have the parents with them, or one of them, or is that the preferred?
Sometimes it's family sessions, so a parent would be, and sometimes individual. Most often it's an individual session with a child.
Are you with them for like a half hour, an hour?
45 minutes to 50 minutes.
Wow, you must see a lot of pain and hurt.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay, well, tell us about the research that you've been doing and things that you've learned about children and trauma.
Sure. So typically kids who come from a traumatic background struggle a lot with behavior, right? So they're feeling big feelings, they don't know how to say it with words, so it comes out. And that can make it harder for them to connect to church as they're acting out, and people misinterpret that. They're disrespectful, they don't care about God, they're just trying to act up. And so it creates a wall that separates them from Jesus. And so, but there are certain churches that are able to tear down that wall and create conditions where every child can engage, where they can connect and feel loved and feel valued and kind of get their emotions under control and feel like they're a valuable part of the community.
So the work that you're doing is focused on the church's ministry to children experiencing trauma. In terms of the book and the ministry work that you're doing, apart from your practice.
Yes, it is. It's the idea is to equip the church, to empower the church to reach those hurting kids. And so we're building on the research. We're using psychological research, sociological research, neuroscience, education theory, and then marrying that with real stories from different churches who've done this well to kind of illustrate those principles and give practical ideas. And that's all together in this book. So it's written in a way that anyone can understand. It's at a 7th grade reading level. So it's not wordy, it's not technical, and anyone who works with kids can pick it up and learn how to do their ministry more effectively.
And how are churches responding to that? I know you've done some training in our community here that was really well received. I know that. So how are churches in general responding to the whole message you're trying to communicate and the training they're doing in the book? And
I think really well, like you said, there's been really positive feedback, which is really exciting. And
We have 5 stars on Amazon.
on our book.
We are the at the moment we are the #1 children's Christian education category book on Amazon.
Nice.
We have stories from churches we've spoken at where they talk about tangible changes in their ministry, where they've thought about behavior in a new way and they've reacted differently, and people are noticing. So I heard of a family that had gone from church to church to church, and their child's behavior was so difficult they would basically get kicked out. Like nicely, but kicked out. And so this church was trained and they started changing what they were doing, and the family shows up. They knew exactly what to do with this kid, and mom says, "This is the first time no one kicked my kid out. Like, this is amazing."
That's
so we're
happened
seeing
a lot to my clients too.
Okay, so in our church here in Temecula, we had a family with a 2-year-old, and he behaved so badly, they said they couldn't have babysitters. They'd have to come home from babysitting because he'd drive the babysitter crazy. And same thing, they'd gone to churches and so on and so forth. And he came to our church and settled in there, and the teachers in the tutors class took a liking to him, and they'd take him walking, but when he'd get upset, and really did, went all out to make him feel comfortable there. And the parents, when they first came, you put the numbers up, and the parents have to come get their child out of the room because of something, and they were just waiting for the number to come up, and it didn't. When they came and got him, they were like almost in tears, and he really settled into the church. And then I think it was sometime like this time of the year, the following November, they had an open microphone Thanksgiving session in the church, and the mom got up in the church and thanked the Lord for the children's worker in the church because they weren't Christians. And they had felt at home in the church, and the mom and dad had given their life to Christ. And it was because the church had reached out to their little 2-year-old who was, he was a behavior issue. But I don't know if it was trauma related or who knows. But so were churches kind of unaware of this issue when you've gone in and done training? Do they not have no awareness of how trauma is affecting children and so on? Or
there's a lot of ignorance of the prevalence of trauma.
yeah.
So they might know that it exists out there somewhere. It's in the Ukraine, it's in those churches, but it's not in our church. We know our kids. And what we found is quite often people don't know what's under the surface. And so we were at a church recently, and they started changing their model as a result of what we're doing, and they got to build stronger relationships. And they found out there were 2 different families that were going through a divorce, and they were actually able to step in and intervene with those families because they had changed the ministry to be more relational, and it opened up the door for them to support the whole family. So a lot of times there is that ignorance, and people react to behaviors. There's sort of this gut response, this gut reaction where the kid's acting up and I get defensive or I get angry, and we're going to send the kid out. That's strike 2.
Consequences.
And so
Class management, got to keep things in control, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and those become those barriers, right? Those obstacles that prevent kids from coming to Jesus. But what you just described with that little boy would be the opposite. So this kid's upset. Instead of reacting to that, I recognize he's having a hard time right now. Let's go for a walk. Let's talk to him, show them that he's cared for and safe. Those would be examples of trauma-informed responses.
Yeah, meeting that underlying need.
Yeah. It's actually hard for me to believe that people aren't aware of that are working with children. Because there's so much going on in our society that is
People are
really
knowing.
tough for children.
Yeah, I think
really tough.
people are knowing, like getting more educated, but it's still not out there the way it needs to be. And the classic model for most churches is 3 strikes, you're out.
It's
You
based on
disrupt the classroom 3 times, you're out.
So there's really churches that are sending kids, like you can't come here anymore.
Yes,
It's a very classical model is, strike one warning, strike two timeout, strike three back to your parents. So it's based on behavior. So traditional educational classroom management is based on behaviorism, which is basically reward and punishment to control behavior. And trauma-informed approaches is the exact opposite. It's relational, it's about empowerment. It's, I'm gonna come beside you, I'm gonna coach you, we're in this together. How can we help you be successful?
Yeah.
And so it's not punitive, it's not controlling, it's you're in charge of your behavior, I'm your ally, I'm gonna help you get there. So it's a very different approach to behavior.
So you mentioned it's relational, and I know that you've done a lot of research with Every Generation Ministries back for years. And so talk about relational ministry and how important that is in the church's work with boys and girls.
I mean, it's central. It can't be overstated, it is central. Some of our very first research was looking at the relationship between kids' connections at church and their relationship with God, their behavior, seeing the fruits of the Spirit manifest in their lives, their self-esteem, right? The way they see themselves, are they worthy? And so the way they connect to adults at church, the way they connect to other kids at church, having a space to share their feelings, to talk about their lives, to get help, to get prayer, this is transformative. And even if they're at church for a short time, these experiences are so powerful that it can have a lasting impact on them the way they grow closer to God and just live their lives. It's central.
Lori, when you've done counseling and therapy sessions and so on, how's relationships and relational ministry factor into that?
I mean, yeah, what Robert said, relationship is the key trauma-informed strategy. It is everything. So coaching parents, or caregivers to come alongside the hurting child to learn about feelings, to hear what the underlying feeling is, to validate that emotion, not to brush it under the rug, to say, no, you're fine, but actually to sit in the hard stuff, to sit in that feeling, allow the child to feel and hold it. That is what changes everything.
We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Our next 5 Smooth Stones podcast will be this same time next week. To learn more about life-changing children's ministry, check out the EGM Institute website at www.egminstitute.org.